The chamber was sealed, and the air itself seemed to rot. Candles burned low, their smoke curling against the velvet drapes that trapped the stench within. The scent of roses had turned sour, soaked with the heaviness of sickness and time. Servants crept barefoot, afraid that the sound of breath alone might wake the thing that waited in the dark. At the center of the room sat Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen of England, wrapped in silks that once gleamed like morning. Now they clung to her skin, damp with fever and perfume. Her face, painted white to defy age, had begun to crack. Beneath the mask, the flesh was surrendering to decay. Sir Robert Carey stood by the door and could not move. Later he would write that the Queen lay still, her finger pressed upon her lips, as if commanding even death to be silent. No one dared speak her name aloud. The kingdom beyond those walls still called her Gloriana. Yet within this chamber she was only a woman who had ruled too long against the truth of her own body. The walls shimmered with the faint echo of prayers, but heaven was silent. The smell grew thicker as wax melted on the floor. Every flicker of light revealed less of the Queen and more of the ruin she had become. The conqueror of empires was losing her last war, not to swords or treason, but to the slow betrayal of flesh. How can a woman worshipped as divine die as something meant to be hidden? Stay with us and subscribe, for what follows is the story of a crown that tried to hide its rot and failed. Before she became the Virgin Queen, she was the silent child of a beheaded mother. The corridors of the Tudor court whispered her name before she could speak it herself. Elizabeth was born into a kingdom still wet with royal blood. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, once the brilliant consort of King Henry VIII, had been adored and then condemned by the same man who had lifted her to the throne. When the axe fell at the Tower, England learned how swiftly a crown could turn to execution. The child left behind would never forget that lesson. She grew up surrounded by faces that smiled without warmth. Courtiers bowed deeply, yet their eyes measured every movement she made. Even her laughter seemed to echo too loudly in rooms that remembered the screams of her mother. Her tutors taught her scripture and philosophy, but the silence of King Henry VIII taught her something far colder. Affection could vanish with a signature. Love, she understood, was not safety but danger in disguise. At Hatfield House, she wandered through the gardens, small and solemn, watching the sky shift from silver to gray. The servants said she read until the candles died, her hair catching light like polished copper. She was beautiful in a way that frightened her, for beauty had killed her mother. In each mirror she saw Anne Boleyn's eyes staring back at her, sharp and bright, filled with both intelligence and doom. When King Henry VIII died, the kingdom trembled. Elizabeth learned to survive by stillness. She watched her brother, the young King Edward VI, take the crown and saw older men pull its strings. Later, when her sister Queen Mary rose to power, the air turned dangerous again. Elizabeth was taken to the Tower, where the ghost of her mother lingered in the stones. She waited in silence, believing that each footstep in the corridor would bring the end, but the blade never came. In that waiting, she discovered the armor of self-control. The girl who once trembled learned to master her breath and her pulse. She would never again allow fear to show on her face. Her body became a fortress ruled by will. Pain was buried. Emotion was trained to obedience. From that silence, she built the poise of a monarch. Years later, when she stood before her mirror, she no longer saw the orphan of Anne Boleyn, but the creation of her own restraint. Her mother had died for being too human. Elizabeth would survive by becoming untouchable, something both sacred and remote. Divinity became her disguise. In the loneliness of her youth, she turned fear into elegance, sorrow into distance, and longing into command. She would never again belong to anyone, not even to herself. The child of execution had grown into a symbol meant to be admired, but never embraced. She was not born to be loved, but to be watched. The years that followed her coronation glimmered with a beauty that seemed eternal. England rose again beneath the banner of Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. In her presence, poets knelt, painters worshipped, and the streets bloomed with banners of gold. She was 25 and radiant, her voice carried like a hymn through the marble halls of Whitehall. They called her the Virgin Queen, the light that restored the broken realm. But light is cruel to the fragile, and beneath its glow her skin began to fracture. The court spoke of her grace as if it were divine. Even William Shakespeare, still a young writer seeking favor, described her beauty in verses meant for eternity. He compared her to the dawn, untainted and remote, a muse whose virtue held the nation together. His words drifted across the kingdom like prayer, strengthening the image she had built for herself. Yet while the poets praised her purity, the queen faced her reflection in secret, tracing the scars left by smallpox and the faint cracks forming beneath the paint. Every morning her maids prepared the same ritual. White powder mixed with vinegar and lead spread gently across her face until her skin gleamed like porcelain. They called it Venetian ceruse, a gift from the alchemists of Italy. But it was no gift. It burned through the years, drying her flesh and poisoning her blood. Elizabeth endured it because she believed beauty was not luxury, but armor. She could not rule a world of men with tenderness. She could only rule by perfection. Visitors marveled at her radiance. André Hureau, the French ambassador, wrote that her face shone like marble, but he smelled rot beneath the roses. He had seen what others did not. The fragrance that surrounded her, once sweet, now clung too thickly to the air. Perfume fought against the scent of lead and sweat, but it could not win. Hurault's letter carried the truth to France, and history kept his words alive like a wound. Still she stood before her people, smiling with the calm of a saint, while her teeth ached and her lips bled. Shakespeare wrote of beauty eternal, but even his quill could not stop the slow decay beneath the crown. The courtiers bowed lower, fearing the tremor in her hand. The maids wiped away blood with linen soaked in rosewater and called it divine color. Night after night, Elizabeth sat alone, her face a white shell under flickering candlelight. The powder cracked when she spoke. The scent of roses grew heavy and still. Each whisper of breath carried both glory and ruin. She had become her own portrait, perfect and lifeless, worshipped yet untouchable. The poets continued to sing. The diplomats continued to flatter. But the woman within the marble mask was already fading. Her power endured, but her flesh paid the price. Behind the fragrance and the verses, something holy had begun to die. The mask that ruled the world began to crack. By the time England called her Gloriana, Elizabeth had already begun to fear the simplest element of all. Water, the mirror of purity, had become her greatest enemy. She believed it carried illness through the pores, that it could slip into her body and drown her spirit. Physicians whispered warnings, servants obeyed, and the royal baths stood untouched. Instead of cleansing, she perfumed. Instead of washing, she prayed. What others found in the river, she sought in the fragrance of roses and wine. Each morning her attendants entered her chamber, carrying bowls of wilted petals and scented oils. They soaked the cloths in a mixture of vinegar, wine, and lavender, pressing them gently to her skin. No water ever touched her. The flowers had long since lost their color, yet she clung to their dying sweetness as if it could guard her from decay. Her gowns were steeped in musk and myrrh until even the walls began to breathe the same perfume. Visitors said the air of her rooms was heavy enough to choke. The scent filled every corner, like incense at a funeral that never ended. The French ambassador André Hureau returned to court and wrote again to his king. He said that the palace was suffocating with incense and silence. He described a place where beauty and rot had learned to live together, where the queen's fragrance lingered like the ghost of something divine. He could not tell if he had stood before a woman or a monument built from scent. At night, the ritual continued. Her maids lit candles of amber and rose, then brushed her hair with combs dipped in oil. She sat motionless as they wrapped her in linens stiff with perfume. The cloth clung to her arms and neck until her body shone like polished wax. The heat of summer brought sweat, but no one dared wipe it away. The sweat was sealed beneath layers of silk and powder, left to ferment against her skin. Beneath the sweetness, the faint odor of something spoiled began to bloom. The palace absorbed her habits. Courtiers drenched themselves in heavy fragrance, fearing to offend her with their natural scent. The gardens outside were stripped of blossoms each morning to feed the queen's endless need for petals. The people adored her radiance, but those who served her knew that the brightness came with a cost. More than one maid fainted while dressing her. They whispered that the air in her chamber could drive a person to sickness. Elizabeth never spoke of these rumors. To her, perfume was not indulgence but protection. It separated her from the world, sealing her in the illusion she had built. The smell of flowers was her armor, her shield against mortality. Within that haze, she could still believe herself untouched, untouched by water, untouched by death. Yet the fragrance that had once been her crown began to betray her. It mingled with sweat and the faint trace of infection, creating a sweetness too thick to bear. Servants opened windows when she slept, desperate for air, but by morning the curtains were closed again. The queen would not have the wind disturb her sanctuary. The air around her grew so dense that courtiers said even music faded within it. Candles burned slower, tapestries absorbed the smell, and the stone corridors carried it like memory. For Elizabeth, this was purity. It was her prayer, her defense against corruption. Though the corruption was already within, the roses withered faster, the oils turned rancid, and still she believed in their power. To wash was to surrender. To scent was to rule. In the end, her palace became a cathedral of fading petals, her body an altar drenched in sweetness and ruin. Cleanliness to her was not purity, but disguise. The mirror that once flattered her began to turn cruel. Beneath the heavy powder and sweet perfume, her scalp had started to die. Years of lead and mercury had seeped through her skin and poisoned the roots of her hair. At first, the loss was slow. A few strands on her pillow, a faint thinning near the temples. Then the patches widened, and the color of her famous copper hair faded into gray. Servants who brushed it at dawn found handfuls tangled in the comb. They buried the fallen locks in silence, fearing her wrath more than her sickness. Soon the queen could no longer bear to look at herself. Her hair had receded so far that her crown no longer fit. She ordered wigs from every corner of the realm, crafted from horsehair, silk, and the scalps of the dead. The maids prepared them in the mornings like holy objects. Each was placed upon a cushion, powdered white, and blessed with perfume before it touched her head. What had begun as vanity became ritual. The ceremony of adornment replaced the act of prayer. They began with a soft layer of linen to hide the wounds. Then came the glue made from animal fat and egg, thick and warm. The queen closed her eyes as it was spread along the rim of her scalp. The smell of it mixed with the sweetness of roses, creating an odor neither pure nor foul, only strange. When the wig was lowered, the weight pressed against her sores until she trembled, but she never spoke. Pain had become her language of rule. To remove the crown was to admit decay. The wigs grew taller with each passing year. Elaborate spirals of curls, braids, and ribbons meant to disguise the hollow beneath. They were monuments to her endurance. Yet beneath them, the skin festered, the glue trapped heat, the sweat pooled, and small infections bloomed into abscesses. When the maids removed the wig at night, flakes of dried blood clung to the lining. Once, a trickle of red ran down her neck and stained the lace at her collar. No one dared mention it. They cleaned in silence and prayed that she would not see the stain. In the stillness of her chamber, the scene repeated each morning and night. Hands trembling with care. Maids adjusted curls, powdered roots, and smoothed the edges where flesh met artifice. The candles burned low and the air filled with the quiet sound of breathing. The wig rested upon her head like a relic that demanded worship. The more it hurt, the more she believed it divine. The pain convinced her she was still alive, still chosen, still sovereign over the body that betrayed her. The glue hardened as the hours passed. When she turned her head, it pulled at her scalp. Sometimes the pain was so sharp that she gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles whitened. But no one saw her wince. The queen had learned to hide agony behind stillness. She had once tamed a kingdom. Now she tamed her own flesh. In the dark corners of her bedchamber, flies gathered near the combs. The maids drove them away with incense, muttering that they were drawn by the perfume, not the rot. Each day the ritual began again, and each day her skin grew thinner. The wigs, polished and perfect, gleamed in the light of morning like crowns forged from sorrow. The courtiers saw majesty. The servants saw blood. The truth lay hidden between the curls of false hair and the pulse of dying skin. No crown could save what was already turning to dust. The crown devoured the flesh that wore it. Night had settled over Richmond Palace like a veil of breathless air. The corridors were silent except for the slow echo of distant steps. In her chamber, the candles trembled against the weight of the dark. The queen sat upon her cushions. The silk of her gown gathered like water around her feet. Her head tilted slightly forward, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. The servants whispered that she had not slept for days. Sir Robert Carey would later write that they feared she was waiting for God to look away. Her face was still white with powder, the same mask she had worn for years. Beneath the light of the candles, the makeup gleamed faintly, soft as dust upon marble. Her lips were pale, pressed into a thin line of resolve. No breath stirred the air. The silence was so deep that the flicker of each flame seemed to speak louder than words. The perfume of roses and amber clung to the room, sweet and suffocating, like the memory of a body long gone. Carrie stood a few paces away, afraid to step closer. He watched her eyes half open and wondered if she saw him at all. Around her, the ladies in waiting moved with the caution of mourners. They adjusted her pillows, brushed the folds of her gown, and waited for a command that never came. Elizabeth's hand rested on the arm of the chair, trembling faintly. The veins beneath the skin dark as ink. Her pulse was a whisper. No prayers were spoken. The chaplain stood ready, but she refused his words. She turned her face from the crucifix and stared instead at the dying flame nearest her. The light shimmered across her cheeks, revealing the fine cracks in the powder, the faint lines of age beneath the white mask. The heat of the candle softened the wax of her face paint, and it began to shine with an unnatural glow. She looked both human and statue, saint and corpse. Outside the chamber, the guards waited with their torches dimmed. Inside, time slowed until it felt like the whole kingdom was holding its breath. The queen, who had commanded nations, now ruled only the silence. Every sigh from her attendants felt like treason. The perfume grew thicker as the night stretched on. Someone placed a new candle near her hand, and for a moment the flame painted her in gold. It made her appear almost alive again, almost as she had been when the poets wrote of her glory. But the illusion lasted only a breath. Carrie wrote that her eyes did not close. Even when her head began to tilt, she seemed to guard the room against death itself. The sound of her breathing was faint, shallow, and then slower still, until even that became uncertain. The maids knelt in a circle around her, their tears falling soundless on the cold floor. The queen did not move. The stillness in her chest deepened into something final, but no one dared speak the word. The candles burned to their ends and left only smoke. The scent of flowers faded, leaving a trace of bitterness behind. For hours they waited, afraid to touch her, afraid to see what the mask had hidden. The dawn crept over the palace in silence, turning the velvet curtains gray. When the first light touched her face, she looked peaceful at last, though peace had come too late. Even in death, she ruled her silence. The body of the queen did not rest. Within days of her death, the scent began to spread through Richmond Palace. What had once been the perfume of roses turned to something darker, thick and sweet like spoiled honey. The embalmers worked in silence, layering her skin with oils and resins, sealing her face beneath wax and cloth. But the decay broke through. The heat of spring quickened what time had already begun. Sir Robert Carey wrote that the odor crept through the halls like a living curse. Servants fainted. Candles were kept burning day and night to mask the stench. Yet it lingered beyond the flames. Her ladies changed her garments again and again, draping her in new silk each morning. But nothing could silence the smell that clung to her flesh. It was as if her body refused to be hidden, as if death itself demanded to be seen. When the coffin was closed, the wood swelled with moisture. Drops of dark fluid gathered along the seams and stained the velvet that lined her bier. The court ordered a second casket, then a third, each sealed more tightly than the last. Yet with every passing day, the corruption grew stronger. Guards changed their shifts every few minutes, unable to stand the air. One of them later whispered that the flies gathered not around the flowers, but around the queen herself. Still, the ceremony had to continue. London awaited the grand funeral promised to its monarch. They dressed the body in white satin and pearls, painted the face again, and placed a wig of golden curls upon the skull. From a distance, she looked untouched, serene, the same image England had worshipped. But beneath the lace and jewels, the flesh had begun to collapse. The cheeks caved inward, the lips stiffened and broke. The Queen's last illusion was rotting from within. When the procession moved toward Westminster Abbey, the wind carried both the scent of flowers and the trace of decay. The people lining the streets bowed their heads, tears in their eyes, never knowing what lay beneath the veil. To them, she was still their virgin queen, eternal and unbroken. Yet the guards who walked beside the coffin knew the truth. They felt the weight of her body shifting, heard the faint wet sound of what remained. At Westminster, beneath the carved angels and the echoing hymns, she was laid beside her half-sister Mary, the air of the abbey filled with roses, incense, and something no prayer could disguise. For days afterward, visitors said the sweetness of the flowers carried a bitter undertone, as though the Queen's perfume still lingered in defiance of time. The Virgin Queen still reigns in portraits, but the earth remembers her scent. Subscribe and descend with us, where beauty, power, and decay become one.